Our epistle lesson for this morning comes to us from Paul's letter to the church in Rome, the 3rd chapter, beginning with the second part of verse 22 and continuing through verse 26. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, I'd invite you to do so at this time. It can be found on page 916. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. He did this to show his righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, and that he justifies the one who has faith in Jesus. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I wonder if any of you have ever heard of a 17th century churchman named Lancelot Andrewes. Lancelot Andrewes. There's no reason necessarily that you would know that name. However, how many of you have ever read from the King James Bible before? Yeah, good. And how many of you have ever, during a reading, either that you did or hearing someone else, appreciated the beauty and the poetry that some of those words in that version of the Bible provide? Yeah, exactly. If you have, then you owe a debt to Lancelot Andrewes. Lancelot Andrewes was the chief and guiding translator of the King James Bible. He was, by one account, the most brilliant man in the English church at that time. Living in the 1600s, Andrewes could speak 15 modern languages and 6 ancient ones. That's 21 languages for you math whizzes out there. But you know what Lancelot Andrewes did every single day? He prayed. He prayed. Not for 5 minutes, but for 5 hours every day. You know what he prayed for 5 hours every day? The miserableness, he said, of his own soul. For me, O Lord, sinning and not repenting, and so utterly unworthy, it were more becoming to lie prostrate before thee, and with weeping and groaning to ask pardon for my sins, than with polluted mouth to praise thee. That's Lancelot Andrewes. Think about this. He was a brilliant man, and he spent 5 hours every day in prayer because he was so consumed with the knowledge and awareness and guilt of his own sin. Our sermon series for the season of Lent is called Back to the Basics. We're exploring different theological topics from a Presbyterian and Reformed perspective. And our topic for today is sin. I can just see you jumping out of your pews with excitement about that. Every Sunday, you and I confess our sin together. Every Sunday, we proclaim the forgiveness of sin together. But I wonder if we are all together when it comes to what we mean by sin. As Cornelius Plantinga Jr., the former president of Calvin Theological Seminary, once wrote, "The awareness of sin used to be our shadow. Christians hated sin, feared it, fled from it, grieved over it. But the shadow has dimmed," he remarks. One of my current day faith heroes is Father Gregory Boyle. Does anybody else here know the name Father Gregory Boyle? Yeah. He's an internationally known speaker, a Jesuit priest, the founder of Homeboy Industries. His work with gang members in Los Angeles knows no peer. He's written 3 books now, and when he writes about God, in those books, Father Boyle does not talk about sin, and he does not describe God as a God that is obsessed with sin and judgment. He describes a God who approaches us with tenderness and sorrow and healing and joy. And that image of God works. So many people's lives have been changed because that image of God works. All of which makes me wonder if I should even be preaching about sin this morning. I was going to put it to you for a vote. No, I'm not going to put it to you for a vote. Our topic this morning is sin. But let me fine-tune the question. What kind of sin do we believe in as Presbyterians? I don't mean kind of sin like the Catholic Church has mortal sins and venial sins, a hierarchy of sins. That's not what I mean. I mean, what's the nature of sin? How do we name it? How do we recognize it? Biblical Hebrew uses 3 different words to describe sin. The first word has the sense of going astray, getting distracted, becoming lost. The second word has the sense of intentional violation, doing something you know is wrong but doing it anyway. And yet a third word in biblical Hebrew carries a sense of utter rebellion, if you will. Our Presbyterian Book of Order says that one of the great themes of the Reformed tradition is a human tendency toward idolatry. It's why we confess our sin together in church every Sunday, and yet that does not mean that we're all of one mind when it comes to sin. For example, if I ask you right now, do you believe that greed is a sin? How many of you believe that greed is a sin? I see like half the arms in the air at this moment. I won't go there. Now, no need to raise your hand with this one. But if I say that greed is not just a problem for the Gordon Geckos of the world, did you get that reference, Gordon Gekko? But because by definition we live in a society that teaches us to think of ourselves as consumers first, as opposed to children of God first, then the sin of greed is not just out there, but it's in every heart in this room. You don't need to raise your hand, but think about whether you agree with that. Or if I say that racism still exists in our society and that's a sin, I suspect I would get nearly unanimous agreement on that statement. But if I say that I believe there is still systemic racism in our society, that it's not just found in a few individuals, but that it's part and parcel of the way that many institutions still operate, I suspect there would not be universal agreement on that statement. In our text from Romans this morning, Paul writes, "For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." When he wrote those words, the Apostle Paul did not mean that everyone has made at least one self-centered, idolatrous decision at some time in their lives. No. For Paul, sin was a force, a power, like a separate entity that exists in our lives and infects God's world. We did not hear this part of the letter, but you may recall later in Romans when Paul writes the following. "I do not understand my own actions," he says, "for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me." The first thing that Presbyterians believe about sin is that we are, more often than not, blind to it. Like Paul describes, it captures us in ways that we cannot recognize or see ahead of time. Do you recall the movie Spotlight that won the Oscar back in 2015? Yeah, a few of you are nodding your heads. Michael Keaton plays Robbie Robinson, who's leading the Boston Globe's team of reporters in its investigation of the cover-up of decades of abuse by Catholic priests. At the end of the movie, as the team is getting ready to go to print with their story, Robbie admits to the team that it's not just the leadership in the Catholic Church that knew something wrong was going on for years and years and did nothing about it, The globe knew. He knew. He had been sent a list of 20 priests who had engaged in abuse, a list that came to him from a lawyer back in 1993, almost 10 years beforehand, and he had failed to follow up. In other words, Robbie Robinson did not do the good he wanted, but the evil he did not want is what he did. It's sin as a force, sin like a virus, sin as something that gets into us when we're not looking and we fail to recognize it. Which leads to the second thing that Presbyterians believe about sin. It's not just something that affects us as individuals, it affects the communities to which we all belong. Communal sin, institutional sin, is not a modern idea. It's a biblical idea. The prophets of old were all over this. They weren't just trying to weed out a few bad apples. Isaiah, Jeremiah, they addressed the people of Israel as a whole. They addressed nations as a whole. Just read the opening chapter of Isaiah. Ah, sinful nation, the prophet writes, people laden with iniquity, offspring who do evil, who have forsaken the Lord. Why do you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, he says, the whole heart faint. Now, those words were written over 2,700 years ago about a people long ago and far away. Why would we think of sin the same way today? Because it's very easy for communities to encourage behavior and normalize behavior and condone behavior that is, in the end, sinful behavior. For example, the high school from which I graduated in 1989 recently changed its mascot. I graduated from J.W. Sexton High School in Lansing, Michigan. Our mascot, when I was there, was the face of a Native American elder or warrior or chief. During the time that I was there, it was changed from a mean-looking face to a smiling face. But the mascot name did not change. We were the Sexton Big Reds. Now, I think about that today and I think, how in the world? But when I was there, I didn't think twice about it. If we won a football game, the crowd was known to chant something like, "Should have been a Big Red." I participated and I had fun. And it never dawned on me that our school's mascot was offensive, a caricature, hurtful to people with Native American heritage in our school and in our community, and harmful in how it shaped any high schooler's understanding of our country's history. Like I said, the school finally changed the name some 30 plus years after I graduated, and I'm glad that they finally did it. It's a public school, so the school would never say it this way, but I can say it this way. The name that was attached to our school in previous years and its mascot, that was a sin. It wasn't a sin of one or two individuals, it was a sin of the entire community, and we didn't even know we were engaging in it. So, what kind of sin do we as Presbyterians believe in? Not just the kind that we can see in other people, but the kind that we're blind to in ourselves. Number two, not just the kind that shows up in individual decisions, but the kind that shows up in the communities that we create. Let me pause here for just a second, though. I'm not sensing a lot of excitement on the looks of your faces right now. I realize that 7 pages into a sermon on sin, it can feel like something of a downer on a Sunday morning, right? I mean, how many of you woke up this morning and thought to yourself, oh boy, I really hope Ben tells us we're a bunch of no-good sinners today? So why spend 20 minutes talking about sin on a Sunday? As Dr. Plantinga writes, when we lack an ear for wrong notes in our lives, we cannot play the right ones or even recognize them in the performance of others. Without full disclosure on sin, the gospel of grace becomes uninteresting and unnecessary. Why do we have a prayer of confession that we say together every Sunday? Not because we believe in a God of fire and brimstone, but because we believe in a God whose grace is sovereign and surprising and utterly overwhelming. You see, Presbyterians believe that when we look squarely at our sin, in a strange paradox, God's grace brings us two gifts. The first gift is humility. Do any of you remember the late Václav Havel? Havel was the former president of the Czech Republic, someone who resisted the communists and was imprisoned for his activities. When he came to power with the Velvet Revolution, Havel was conspicuously forgiving toward his former enemies and other collaborators. While some criticized him for this, he held firm. About the Central European regimes in the 1970s and 80s, Havel remarked, "The line between good and evil did not run clearly between us and them, but through each and every person." Or as Paul put it in our text for today, there is no distinction. So, talking about our sin can lead to humility. That's the first gift. And the second thing it leads to is hope. In her searing memoir, Becoming Miss Burton, Sue Burton tells about a difficult childhood, growing up under the shadow of abuse and poverty in Los Angeles. When her 5-year-old son died after being hit by a police car, she turned to drinking and drugs to numb the pain. She made poor decisions. She went in and out of prison time and again. She sinned time and again. After her 6th time being released from prison, she found a treatment program in Santa Monica. "I had doom written all over me," she writes. Soon after entering the program, she attended her first AA meeting. "No one there seemed to judge my piteous condition," she said. "The immediate compassion, the empathy, the love that rolled off these strangers was enough to put a sizable dent in all my pain and my sorrow and my guilt. In that room," she said, "I found hope." She also found more than that. Before long, Sue Burton found a minimum wage job, saved $13,000 and bought herself a house, but it wasn't just for her. It was for other women like her. Sue Burton would go to the bus station where women would walk off the bus, recently released from prison, and she would offer them a clean and sober place to get their lives back on track. She called her program A New Way of Life. That was back in 1998. Fast forward 25 years, A New Way of Life has turned into 5 transitional houses in LA with 12-step programs and free legal services. Sue Burton has helped more than 1,000 formerly incarcerated women through the years. She's received numerous awards for her work, national awards. But perhaps one of the best moments came well before she started receiving awards. Immediately after Sue Burton was released from the treatment program, she needed a place to stay. So she called her grown daughter, who had been through the ringer with her mother and was skeptical of letting her mom stay with her. But Sue Burton's daughter had a daughter, and Sue Burton's granddaughter said to her mother, "We can't say no. Grandma's a different person now." And her granddaughter said to her, "Grandma, I know you did some bad things, but you're not a bad person." Her words, Sue Burton writes, meant everything. Now, I have no idea what Sue Burton's granddaughter's faith is, but she would have made an excellent Presbyterian, I'll tell you that. Sin might blind us and capture us, but it can never define us. It can never take away our baptismal identities as children of God. That's the third thing Presbyterians believe about sin. It does not define our lives. Only God's grace can do that. So let me invite you to do something right now. I want you to think of something that you still feel guilty about. Some words, perhaps, that you spoke too rashly that you wish you could take back. Or maybe some time long ago when you wounded someone and the guilt is still there. Can you think of something like that? Now I want you to recall the 6 very important words that we said earlier today. In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. That was a whisper. Let's try it again. In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. That's good. You love it when I do this with you, right? Let's say the whole thing together one more time. 1, 2, 3. In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. That's what Presbyterians believe happens to sin. You know what that means? That guilt that you brought with you? There's plenty of space available in the pews this morning. You can leave that guilt right there and walk out a new person when you leave today.